Jim Morrison had a poetic ambition that maybe this thing would have worked better as an epic poem than it would have as a piece of music. It's not very melodic, certainly. The scraps that have survived, you get the impression that they really couldn't figure out what to do with it arrangement-wise. On the Absolutely Live album, where they did kind of a pseudo version, it just kind of meanders and it's not very captivating. The fragment they did use on Waiting for the Sun, Not to Touch the Earth, I think that's pretty cool, actually. I think it was a good decision to like abandon that and say, well, let's take the part which is most powerful, even though it's pretty weird and it's certainly not going to be something you can go around humming, and put that on there. I think that works okay, actually.
Despite the criticisms leveled at the band for producing more obviously commercial material and the band's failure to properly craft the Celebration of the Lizard, Waiting for the Sun was nevertheless a huge commercial success. Not only was it their first US #1 album, it was also their breakthrough record in other territories. And in September, they traveled to Europe for their first tour outside of their homeland. Yet the live shows presented other problems. Since being arrested on stage at the end of 1967, Morrison's explosive stage persona was becoming notorious, while the audience themselves were erupting at the gigs and riots were breaking out. Many were now attracted to the shows simply for the unpredictable spectacle itself.
Morrison's behavior, which became erratic or unpredictable, both private and public, obviously drew people to the concerts. I mean, there were people, the music, that doesn't keep concerts going. You've got to have music. But you add the element of what's he going to do? He got the reputation of throwing the mics around, falling off the stage, jumping off lights, whatever, showing up drunk. And I'm sure people showed up just to see that.
Yet this unpredictable element of Morrison's live persona had always been a key part of the Doors' set, and a manifestation of the singer's artistic philosophy. Writer Richard Goldstein had observed this from the earliest of shows.
I was really aware of his fragility, and this was something that I noticed in a number of rock stars in the 60s whom I got to spend time with, that unlike stars today, they were fragile people. And that going on stage, they accessed sort of core neurotic material and put it out there for the audience. There wasn't any kind of armor. The idea was to shatter through the armor and to show the flesh and blood beneath. And so that's another thing that I think Morrison was out to do. It was a very 60s kind of ritual, self-exposure. And he was one of the artists who engaged in self-exposure.
Yet this self-exposure, as well as his damaging consumption of alcohol and narcotics, was taking its toll on Morrison. In Amsterdam, the singer passed out before a headline show and the other Doors performed without him. When the band returned to tour domestically in November, Morrison was often inebriated and more riots broke out. The Doors, as a live act, were beginning to spiral out of control.
He had found, I think, from communicating with people in concert, that he needed to protect himself. He couldn't put himself out there as much as he started out doing. It was just all the time, all the way, every night. Then he realized pretty early on, I think, that this was not going to work for him. He just couldn't really do it. He didn't want to give away as much of himself as he had started out doing. So he tended to put the mask on. He would put the Morrison mask on, and that would be something that people could relate to, and he could still be there behind that mask and feel safe and protected because it was just the mask that people were doing the relating to. Now the problem with that sort of thing is that pretty soon the mask starts getting stuck to your face and you can't take it off. And you start feeding into the mask and the mask starts feeding into you. And that's where all the trouble started, because he was, to a certain extent, an unstable personality. There was a difficulty with alcohol. I'd be very silly if I didn't fess up to that. But, you know, there are ways to handle that. Unfortunately, back then, we didn't know about AA, or if we did, it wasn't for cool, hip people like us. So he never got the help that he needed, and he really could not do it by himself. So that's where all the trouble started.
Yet these problems did not affect the Doors' continued commercial success. In December, the single Touch Me was released, introducing a radically different sound from their previous work. Heavily featuring both string and brass instruments, the song was immediately accused of being lightweight by critics, and even some of the fan base were concerned by the band's new direction. Yet by early 1969, Touch Me had peaked at number 3 in the Billboard Top 100.
I like the song. I mean, it's popish, but, you know, how many moonlight drives can you go on before you finally say, I just want to feel love till the stars fall? I mean, how many times can you go on moonlight drives and passionate, light my fire, baby, let's get it on, before, you know, occasionally it's like, oh, I'm going to love you till the stars fall. You know, what, the nice popish, that feeling doesn't elude them, so they're acknowledging it. I think for critics is to pan them on that. They're not being honest. Don't sit there and tell me you haven't felt some popish love for somebody. I mean, there's a spectrum there, and the Doors are expressing it.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe.
You know, what people are complaining that it's too commercial, that's because that was the state of the discourse. It doesn't really have a whole, you know, the discourse doesn't always follow the actual facts. The discourse has an arc and a logic of its own. And by that time, the notion that this supposedly avant-garde band was selling out, that was the narrative, as they say these days, and so people followed it. And I think when you look back, Touch Me is not as commercial, whatever that means, a song, as Hello, I Love You. It's not as accessible, it's not as unthreatening. It has a little more daring to it, and while still being completely within the realm of acceptability.
The people that were likely to be turned off by the Doors, quote, going commercial had already kind of been turned off slightly by Hello, I Love You. So at this point, they were just kind of, what's next? I mean, the bigger question was probably, you know, are these guys' songs going to still be good or not? You know what I mean? And that actually, the song did pretty well, I thought, from a radio standpoint, and it was just kind of funny. But I mean, I got to say, as much as I like that song when I hear it on the radio now, or even if I hear it in my car, it's not the first one I think of when I think of the Doors at all. You know, in fact, I tend to think of a television performance by that where they just, I think it might have been the Ed Sullivan Show or some other show, Smothers Brothers Show maybe, where they just spotlit the sax player, and I just said, this is like the strangest thing I've ever seen with the Doors. It was odd, it was good. I mean, that was something my parents actually watched with me, so that says a lot about it.
I always thought that was a great song. And not just great in that, like, Hello, I Love You is catchy, but there's all these jazzy elements to it, which are not standard fare for a song that was recorded, I believe it would have been about late '68, by any means. And it's one of Morrison's greatest vocal performances. Now, that's the performance more than any other that I think people would say he's trying to affect kind of a Frank Sinatra-like persona. But that part of his presentation had never been absent. When you hear the first part of The Crystal Ship, for instance, on the very first album, that crooning quality really comes through. But it doesn't sound like say, Scott Walker, who was doing very good stuff, but his vocal delivery isn't that much different from, say, a Frank Sinatra or Jack Jones, and the settings that he's using are kind of adult pop settings. Morrison is using that crooning tone, but these are heavy psychedelic rock songs.
He worked on it very consciously. He always said that his favorite male vocalists were Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley. And Elvis, okay, but Frank? I have never been a Frank Sinatra fan. I don't hear it. It must be like that thing only dogs can hear, and I just do not get it. But yeah, he was a big Frank Sinatra fan, and Perry Como too. So yeah, the crooner element was definitely part of it, because I think his voice, his kind of voice, that really deep, velvety baritone, very much lent itself to that sort of thing. So obviously he was going to sing to his strengths, as it were.
Despite negativity from some elements of the music press, Touch Me was yet another million-selling #1 single, and the Doors had become the most successful homegrown rock band in America. Yet Morrison's defiant attempts to break down the boundaries of conformity, fueled by his incessant intake of alcohol and narcotics, was about to irreversibly change the band's fortunes. Arriving inebriated at a concert at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami on March 1st, 1969, the singer's wild and unrestrained performance saw the Doors targeted by conservative society and the state, and accusations of drunken misconduct, violence, and indecent exposure led to a warrant being issued for the arrest of James Douglas Morrison.
In retrospect, there was going to be some point that they were going to run up against the wall like that. They were going to, there was going to be an incident. In retrospect, I couldn't imagine that group with Jim out front not having some incident test, you know, how far they wanted to go.
Morrison grew to have a tremendous amount of frustration and contempt for his fans because, in his view, they didn't want the shaman. They just wanted the body. They were only interested in one thing, and it just made him really enraged. He constantly talked about it. So when I heard that he had, you know, whipped out his junk in Florida, I thought, well, sure, of course, this is what he thought they wanted. And actually, he was throwing it in their faces. So it turned out his junk was the least interesting thing about him.
In April, Morrison surrendered to the FBI and was released on $5,000 bail. This in turn began a protracted court case that targeted the singer as a chaotic symbol of the counterculture, and the surrounding campaign to punish Morrison won favor from high-profile conservatives, including newly elected President Richard Nixon.
I think Jim Morrison and the Doors got into trouble because of what happened at their Miami concert for a few reasons, but maybe something that people don't realize, especially now because that kind of behavior on stage has become more prevalent in our times, is first of all, in the context of his time, it was more shocking than it is now, but also the Doors were a much bigger target than, say, Iggy Pop of the Stooges, who was doing stuff that I would consider to be much more objectionable if you're going to impose morality on something, cutting yourself in front of an audience. If, as some people have said, the establishment were really looking for targets, and I believe they were at that time, Jim Morrison made a great one because he had, to be honest, made himself a target by what he did in Miami, whether he exposed himself or not, but also because he was so well known at that point and the Doors were so well known. That's what I think was really at the heart of Jim Morrison. It wasn't because he exposed himself on stage. I mean, and if he did, hardly anybody would have seen it anyway. I mean, it was just ridiculous. It was really trying to put a nail in the coffin of the counterculture, if that was even possible, which it wasn't. So the whole thing was a ridiculous tragedy, in my view.
I think he knew from the first that he was doomed. We talked about it a little, obviously, when we were, you know, alone together, and we discussed it quite a bit, and he just said, they're out to hang me. And I said, yeah, they kind of are. And he said, I'm not going to get off. And I said, no, you're not, you know. And I think he got off on the worst of the felony counts, but he did get indicted on and convicted on a bunch of other ones, which I think would have resulted something like 6 months in the Dade County Slammer. So there was that. But he knew from the first that he was not going to get through it. Nobody here gets out alive. And I think what he had resolved in his head was that A, nobody was going to see how upset he was, and B, he was going to try to do it as much as possible on his own terms. He did not want not to testify, even though his lawyer was very much against it, as I understand. He seemed to feel that this would be the only chance he was going to get to be able to explain to people, even though he knew they weren't going to understand a word of what he was saying, about himself, about the counterculture, about what he was doing as an artist, about his background, about all these things. He knew it wasn't going to avail him in the slightest, but he did want to get it there and get it on record that this is how he felt about it, and that people should know about it, and the jury should certainly take that into consideration.
While Morrison struggled through the court cases and the surrounding media circus, the band's career was effectively put on hold. Having already recorded the majority of the material for the next album, they were preparing to hit the road with a series of gigs already planned. Yet states across America were lining up to leap on the decency bandwagon and refused to allow the Doors to appear either on stage or on the airwaves. Recently established public television network PBS, however, decided to buck the trend and invited the band to perform on an hour-long show presented by the Doors' longtime advocate, Richard Goldstein.
I think actually the Doors did it because they really appreciated the chance to get on television without the commercial fanfare and trappings, which were unavoidable in almost any other context where American bands could appear on television in those days. And the guy who interviewed them on the show, Richard Goldstein, was a friend of the band who'd been one of the earlier people to write about them seriously. I think they really appreciated the chance to go on not as entertainers, not to like to fill in some space to get somebody ratings, but to present the best of their new music and to discuss it quite seriously, as you see in the interview segments.
I read a little bit about shamanism, but in tribes, the shaman could be any age. The whole tribe, all ages, kind of tried to push him into his trip.
I think he was beginning to fall apart as a personality. And I think that's what you know. That's why the music is more reflexive. I think, you know, this happens to artists, American artists, all the time. Look at Tennessee Williams, an artist who lost his ability to provide coherence, even though his poetic instincts remained intact through his later life. And I think a similar process was going on with Morrison, accelerated by drugs and booze. You know, this inability to be able to hold things together. You know, I was aware in looking at him, bearded now, of how much sadder he looked. He seemed depressed rather than paranoid to me. And I think that's really the key to it. I think his personality was falling apart, and he was losing it as an artist.